He gave up everything for a stranger. What happened next broke every rule about how the world works. A man with $12 in his pocket and one shot left at saving his daughter's future. A woman in a wheelchair who'd spent 3 years learning that most people look away when things get hard. One ordinary Tuesday morning on a city bus that neither of them would ever forget. And a choice made in 4 seconds that rewrote both their lives completely. If a stranger's split-second decision once changed your world, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like, and let's begin. The alarm went off at 5:47, which was 13 minutes before Daniel Carter had set it, because he hadn't actually slept. He'd been lying on his back in the dark since around 2 in the morning, staring at the water stain on the ceiling above his bed, the one shaped vaguely like the state of Texas, and running numbers in his head that refused to add up no matter how many times he shuffled them around. The rent was 31 days overdue. The notice had been slipped under the door last Thursday, and he'd read it so many times the paper had gone soft at the fold. Ellie's tuition for the spring semester was due by end of week, and if it wasn't paid, she'd be pulled from class. His savings account had $42 in it. His checking had $12. He reached over and silenced the alarm before it could wake Ellie. For a minute, he just sat on the edge of the mattress, elbows on his knees, looking at the floor. His interview suit was hanging on the back of the closet door, the only piece of the closet that didn't have something wrong with it. He'd dropped it at the dry cleaner 3 weeks ago when he'd first gotten the call, paid $9 to have it pressed, and since then he'd been rotating around it in the apartment like it was made of something fragile, which, in a way, it was. It was the last good thing he owned that still looked the part. He stood up slowly, the way a man stands when his body is tired in a way sleep doesn't fix, and went to check on his daughter. Ellie's door was cracked. He pushed it open an inch and looked in. She was 7 years old and she slept like she was in the middle of an argument with someone, covers half off, one arm flung out over the edge of the mattress, dark hair across her face. The nightlight beside her dresser cast everything in pale orange. On her desk, half finished, was a drawing she'd been working on for 2 days. A picture of a house with a big tree in the yard, 2 people standing out front, one tall, one small. Under the small one, she'd written in her careful, serious handwriting, "Me and Dad." Daniel stood there for longer than he meant to. Then he pulled her door mostly closed and went to make coffee with the last of the grounds. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that had never quite decided whether it wanted to be respectable or not. The hallway smelled like someone else's cooking and old carpet. The elevator had been out of service for going on 3 weeks, which wasn't a crisis for Daniel, but was, he imagined, a significant problem for Mrs. Okafor in 4C, who was 81 and moved with a walker. He'd carried her groceries up twice since the elevator went down. She always tried to pay him, and he always refused, and she always ended up pressing a $5 bill into his jacket pocket when he wasn't paying attention anyway. He'd started finding the bills at home, confused, before he figured out what she was doing. He drank his coffee standing at the kitchen window, watching the city come on. It was mid-March and still cold. The sky that particular shade of flat gray that could mean anything, overcast clearing or the start of a full day's drizzle. Down on the street, the first commuters were already moving, heads down, collars up. A delivery truck was double parked outside the convenience store on the corner, hazard lights blinking orange in the gray. A man was walking a dog that clearly did not want to be walked. Daniel had moved to this city. Harwick, a mid-sized place in the mid-Atlantic that was neither quite urban nor quite not, 6 years ago, after Ellie's mother left. That was the clean way to say it. The fuller truth was that Amanda had left, then come back, then left again more definitively, and somewhere in the middle of all that back and forth, Daniel had gotten custody of a 14-month-old daughter and a 2-bedroom apartment that was now too expensive for one income, and had been, if he was being honest, too expensive before that. He'd worked at Renfield and Associates for 4 years, a mid-level project management role at a logistics firm that was neither exciting nor terrible, just steady, which was what he needed. Then the company had restructured in November, which was a corporate word for a process that had ended with Daniel and 19 other people sitting in a conference room on a Wednesday afternoon listening to an HR manager explain the severance package. He'd shaken the man's hand at the end. He still wasn't sure why. That had been 4 months ago. He'd applied for 43 jobs since then. He'd gotten 6 callbacks. He'd made it to second-round interviews at 3 companies. He'd gotten 2 rejections in one situation where they simply never called back at all, which was somehow worse. This morning was the 4th. Callaway Group. It was a supply chain consultancy, mid-sized, solid reputation, had been around for 20 years. The position was operations manager, which was exactly what he'd been doing at Renfield, more or less, but with better pay and what the job listing had described as significant growth potential, which Daniel had allowed himself to interpret as meaning something. The interview had been arranged by a recruiter named Marcus Webb, who'd been the first person in 4 months to call him back with something that sounded genuinely enthusiastic. "They liked your resume," Marcus had told him. "I mean, they liked it. The hiring manager specifically asked for you by name after the phone screen. Daniel, I'm not going to oversell it, but this one's real." Daniel had written that down on a piece of paper and put it on his refrigerator. This one's real. He looked at it every morning. He looked at it now, finishing the last of his coffee. He woke Ellie at 7. She emerged from consciousness the way she always did, reluctantly, then all at once. One moment she was a lump under blankets, the next she was sitting up and already talking. "Is today the day?" she asked. "Today's the day." "Your interview?" "Yeah." She looked at him with an expression that was difficult to categorize. 7-year-olds, Daniel had found, were capable of a kind of focused evaluation that adults usually dressed up in more social layers. She was just looking at him straight on, assessing. "You should wear the blue tie," she said finally. "I was going to wear the gray one." "The blue one is better." "How do you know which tie is better?" "Because the gray one makes you look like you're already apologizing for something." He stared at her. "Where did you even— Who told you that?" "Nobody?" She climbed out of bed and headed toward the bathroom. "I just know things." He stood in her doorway for a second, shaking his head slowly. Then he went and got the blue tie. Bokchit. Breakfast was cereal and toast and a glass of orange juice that Daniel poured for Ellie and watched her drink while he stood at the counter with his second coffee. Instant this time, grim but functional. He'd made her a sandwich for lunch, written her name on the paper bag the way he always did, added a small drawing of a dog in the corner because she'd asked him to start doing that about a month ago, and he'd kept it up because it took 30 seconds and made her smile when she found it at noon. "Dad," she said, between spoonfuls of cereal. "What?" "If you get the job." "When?" She looked up. Something shifted in her face. "When you get the job. Can we get a plant?" He blinked. "A plant?" "For the apartment, like a real one, not fake." She was very serious about this. "I read that plants make the air better. And they're nice to have." "They're nice to have," he repeated. "They make a place feel like somebody actually lives there." He didn't say anything for a second. The apartment he knew was not exactly warm. It was functional, clean mostly, but it had the particular quality of a space that had been survived in rather than lived in. Furniture arranged for efficiency rather than comfort. No art on the walls except Ellie's drawings, which she taped up herself in the hallway with an independence that quietly embarrassed him. "Yeah," he said, "we can get a plant. A big one. We'll see how big." "I want one that goes to the ceiling." She held her hand above her head to indicate ceiling-going height. "That's a tree. You want a tree in the apartment." "I want something that grows," she said, and looked back at her cereal. Daniel turned toward the window so she wouldn't see his face. Vos. He dropped Ellie at school at 7:50, which was 5 minutes before the bell. She had her backpack on and her lunch bag, and she walked the last half block slightly ahead of him, the way kids do when they're at the age where they still want you close but are also practicing independence. At the entrance, she turned around and looked at him. "You're going to be great," she said. He crouched down to her level. She was wearing the red jacket with the broken zipper pull that he'd been meaning to fix for 2 weeks. He made a note to fix it tonight. "You think so?" "Yes," said with absolute conviction. No hedging, no qualification. The kind of confidence that only exists when you haven't yet learned to be afraid of being wrong. He hugged her, maybe a half-second longer than usual. She smelled like shampoo and orange juice. "I'll see you at 3:30, he said. 3:30. Don't be late." "I won't be late." "You're sometimes late." "I won't be today." She gave him one more evaluating look, then turned and walked into the school. He watched until she disappeared through the door. Then he straightened up, adjusted his tie, the blue one, and started walking toward the bus stop. The number 12 ran from the Delwood neighborhood down through the center of Harwick and into the financial district, a route that took roughly 35 minutes in normal traffic and roughly 50 in the kind of conditions that existed on any given Tuesday morning in March, which was to say, congested, stop and start, occasionally maddening. Daniel had taken it enough times to know the rhythms. The long light at Chester Avenue, the cluster of stops around the university where the bus always filled up, the stretch along Meridian that moved freely until it didn't. The stop near Ellie's school was a corner with a green metal bench and a plastic shelter that was mostly there as a suggestion. He arrived at 8:02. The bus would come at 8:12, which would get him downtown by 8:50, which gave him 40 minutes before the interview at 9:30. He'd planned this, had tested the route twice in the past week, walked the 2 blocks from the stop to the Callaway Group offices to know how long it took. Everything was accounted for. He stood at the shelter and did what people at bus stops do. Checked his phone, didn't find anything requiring attention, put it away. Checked it again 3 minutes later for no reason. The cold had an edge to it. He'd worn his good coat, the wool one, because it was the only coat he owned that matched the suit, but it wasn't quite warm enough for the morning air, and he stood with his hands in his pockets. The briefcase handle looped around one wrist. The briefcase had belonged to his father. It was old, real leather, a little scuffed at the corners. His father had been an accountant for 30 years, had carried that briefcase to the same office building in Pittsburgh every weekday for 3 decades. Daniel had taken it after his father died 3 years ago and hadn't used it much, hadn't had occasion to. But this morning he'd packed it with his resume copies and the notepad where he'd written his interview prep notes and a pen that actually worked. The weight of it felt right. 2 other people were waiting at the stop. A teenage boy in headphones who was not paying attention to anything, and an older woman in a puffy blue coat who kept looking down the street in the direction the bus would come from, as though looking hard enough would speed it up. Daniel sympathized. The bus arrived 2 minutes late, which was on time by any reasonable standard. He got on, tapped his transit card, and moved toward the middle of the bus. It was moderately full, maybe 20 people, the usual mix of morning commuters, a few people who looked like they worked in service jobs, some university students. He found a spot near the back, standing, gripping the overhead bar with one hand and holding the briefcase with the other. He was reviewing his interview notes in his head, the way he'd planned to answer the question about his gap in employment, the 3 examples he'd prepared for behavioral questions, the question he was going to ask the hiring manager about team structure, when the bus made its next stop at Holden Street and several more people boarded. That was when he first noticed the woman in the wheelchair. She came on last, after the standing passengers had cleared enough space for the ramp. The driver lowered it with a hydraulic hiss, and she rolled on with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. No hesitation, no asking for help, a smooth, practiced arc that brought her to the designated space at the front of the bus where the fold-up seats had been cleared. She locked her wheels, pulled out her phone, and was looking at the screen before the ramp had even folded back up. She was maybe 30, 31. Dark hair cut short and practical. A gray coat, good quality. The kind of face that was interesting without being conventionally pretty. Strong jaw, serious eyes. The look of someone who spent a lot of time thinking and didn't particularly care what that looked like from the outside. There was a leather laptop bag in her lap, flat and expensive looking. Daniel noticed her the way you notice people on public transit. Briefly, incidentally, then not at all. He looked back down at the floor and went back to running his interview prep in his head. The bus moved on. The trouble started around the Carver Street stop, which was roughly the middle of the route. There were 2 men standing near the back of the bus, not far from where Daniel was. He'd been peripherally aware of them since they'd boarded. They were in their mid-20s, loud in the way that's more about performance than actual enthusiasm, the kind of loud that's designed to be heard. One was taller, wearing a heavy jacket. The other was shorter, in a black hoodie, and had been on his phone constantly since getting on. They were arguing about something. At first it was contained, or sure, low voices that Daniel had mostly tuned out, the particular white noise of a disagreement he had nothing to do with. Then it escalated. The voices got sharper. Other passengers began the process of visible non-noticing. Phones brought up higher, eyes down, the practiced urban maneuver of pretending not to hear. "I told you to give it back," the taller one said. His voice had an edge now. "I don't have it, man. I already told you." "Don't lie to me right now. I'm not doing this right now." "I'm not lying." "Then what happened to it? Because it was in my bag when we got on the last bus and now it's not." The shorter one threw his hands up. "I don't know what happened to your stuff. You're the only one who—" "Don't finish that sentence, I swear." The bus lurched to a stop at a light, and neither of them caught themselves well, and they collided, which was bad luck in a situation that was already fragile, and the taller one grabbed the shorter one's arm. Not hard, maybe not intentionally, and the shorter one yanked back, and then they were properly shoving each other in the back of a city bus, and everyone around them was scrambling to get out of the way. Daniel stepped back. The briefcase swung against his leg. A woman to his left made a sharp sound and moved toward the door. Other passengers were pressing forward, away from the back, and the bus was filling with that anxious, crowded energy that happens when a confined space suddenly feels smaller. The bus driver, a heavy-set man in his 50s who'd clearly seen variations of this scenario, was yelling for them to stop. Someone near the front was calling for the doors to be opened. Daniel was watching the two men, calculating without quite meaning to. They were escalating, but not seriously, probably burning out fast. This was going to be over in 30 seconds, either way. When the bus lurched again, harder this time, the driver hitting the brakes sharply as someone stumbled too close to the front. In the chaos of bodies stumbling and repacking, Daniel heard it, a sharp, hard sound. Something hitting the floor rail. A cut-off gasp. He looked toward the front of the bus. The wheelchair had shifted. The lock had held, but a standing passenger, thrown by the bus's sudden braking, had collided with the side of it, and the impact had jarred something. The woman had been reaching to grip a rail for stability, and her arm had been caught at an angle, and now she was holding it against her body in a way that wasn't casual. Her face was controlled. That was the first thing he noticed. She was working very hard to look like she was fine. Her jaw was set, and she was breathing through her nose in that deliberate way people breathe when they're managing pain and don't want to advertise it. Her phone had fallen to the floor. The passenger who'd hit her had already moved on, was pressing toward the front doors. In the commotion, nobody was looking at the woman in the wheelchair. Daniel was already moving. He got to her in about 5 steps, which was more navigation than distance given the packed aisle. He crouched down to get below her eye line. "Hey," he said, not loudly. "Are you hurt?" She looked at him. The control in her expression didn't change, which he now read not as fineness, but as the practiced armor of someone who hated being perceived as needing help. "I'm fine," she said. "Okay. Are you sure? Because I said I'm fine." There was something flat in her voice. Not rude exactly, but closed. The tone of someone who has learned that showing vulnerability on a bus, in a wheelchair, at 30 years old, tends to produce responses ranging from useless to condescending. Daniel sat back on his heels for a second. Her phone was on the floor 2 feet away. He reached for it and held it out to her. She took it with her right hand. Her left arm was still held at an angle against her body. "That's not how you hold a hand that doesn't hurt," Daniel said. She looked at him sharply. "I'm not trying to be in your business," he said. "But that guy who hit you came in hard and your chair moved. If it's just bruised, fine. But if something's wrong, we should know that before the bus gets moving again." The bus, in fact, had stopped. The driver had managed to remove the 2 arguing men. Both had been herded off at a stop with the assistance of another passenger, and was on the radio, presumably to dispatch. The other passengers were rearranging themselves in that post-conflict way, slightly wired, checking their phones, looking at nothing. The woman in the wheelchair looked at Daniel for a long moment. She seemed to be running some internal assessment. "It's my shoulder," she said finally. "I think I pulled something." "Which one?" "Left." "Okay." He thought about this. "Can you move it?" She tried. Something crossed her face. Quick, controlled, then gone. "Somewhat." "Does it feel like a muscle pull, or does it feel deeper?" She looked at him differently now. "Are you a doctor?" "No, I just..." I grew up with a brother who played football. I know what a shoulder that might be more than a pull looks like. She thought about that. Then, it feels deep. Okay, Daniel said. Then we should get someone to look at it. I'm not trying to make a thing out of this. I just think it's worth not ignoring. The woman looked at him for another moment. Then she said, with a kind of careful precision, I have a meeting in 40 minutes. I have an interview in 40 minutes, Daniel said. They looked at each other. So we're both inconvenienced, she said. Seems like it. The bus driver was coming back down the aisle now, checking on passengers. Daniel flagged him. What followed was the slow-moving machinery of minor emergencies. The driver radioing in, the bus being held at a stop, a call being made, the particular bureaucratic texture of a situation where nobody has been seriously hurt, but paperwork still needs to exist. The woman, Daniel didn't know her name yet, she hadn't offered it, and he hadn't asked, sat with her left arm against her chest and answered questions from the driver in a voice that was composed and precise in the way of someone very accustomed to being in charge of information. Daniel stayed beside her. He wasn't sure exactly when he made the decision to stay, whether it was a decision at all or just the thing that happened because leaving felt wrong. He checked his watch once, then he stopped checking it. He called Marcus Webb. Hey, Marcus, it's Daniel Carter. Daniel, hey. I was just going to send you a good luck text. You're about an hour out. I'm not going to make it, Daniel said. The words felt strange in his mouth. There's been an incident on the bus. Someone was hurt. I'm staying with them until help arrives. A pause. Daniel, I know. The hiring manager specifically requested, I know, Marcus, I know. He closed his eyes for a second. He thought about the rent notice. He thought about Ellie's tuition. He thought about the drawing on the desk, the two figures out front of the house. He thought about $12. Can you call them? Explain? Ask if there's any way. I'll try, Marcus said, and the tone of his voice told Daniel exactly how much that effort was likely to produce. Daniel, man, they're not going to wait. I know. He hung up, looked at his watch again, not for any particular reason, then put his phone away. The woman in the wheelchair was looking at him. You missed your interview, she said. Not a question. Yeah. You didn't have to stay. Probably not. So why did you? He thought about that for a second. It wasn't a question he could answer with anything that wouldn't sound either theatrical or stupid, so he went with the simple version. Because someone should. She held his gaze for a moment. Her expression had shifted, not warmer exactly, but more open, like a door that hadn't been moved in a while had been pushed and had given more than expected. Sophie Lang, she said, and held out her right hand. He shook it. Daniel Carter. What was the interview for? Operations manager at Callaway Group. Something shifted in her eyes. Callaway, she said, in a tone he couldn't quite read. I know them. He nodded. There wasn't much to say to that. The help was on its way. The morning was gone. The rent notice was still on the kitchen counter at home. The bus sat at the side of the road in the gray March morning, and Daniel Carter stood in the aisle with his briefcase and his blue tie and the entirely ordinary ruins of his best-laid plans, thinking about nothing in particular, wondering what the water stain on his ceiling was going to look like tonight, and whether, when this was over, he'd be able to figure out a way to explain to a 7-year-old what it meant to do the right thing when the right thing cost you. He didn't have an answer. He just knew he'd stayed. That, for now, had to be enough. The paramedics arrived 11 minutes after the driver called it in, which felt both fast and slow depending on which part of Daniel's brain was doing the measuring. The practical part noted that 11 minutes was a reasonable response time for a non-critical call on a Tuesday morning. The other part, the part that had been quietly calculating and recalculating everything since the moment he'd put his phone back in his pocket, was aware that 11 minutes was also the difference between arriving at Callaway Group at 9:20 with time to collect himself and not arriving at all. He stayed where he was. The two paramedics were a man and a woman, both in their 30s, both carrying the specific brand of brisk competence that comes from doing the same thing with high stakes enough times that the urgency becomes internalized rather than performed. The woman went directly to Sophie. The man swept the bus quickly with his eyes, checking for anyone else who'd been hurt. Sophie was cooperative with the paramedics in the way she'd been cooperative with Daniel. Precise, economical, providing only the information that was asked for and nothing extra. She described the impact, the angle, what she'd felt. She moved her arm when asked. She made a sound once, brief and controlled, when the woman pressed along her shoulder blade, and then her jaw was set again and she was back to answering questions in that flat, composed voice. Daniel stood 2 steps back, out of the way, giving them room. He had his briefcase in one hand and his phone in the other. He hadn't looked at the phone since the call with Marcus. He wasn't sure what he was waiting to see on it. "Sir?" The male paramedic turned to him. "Were you involved?" "I wasn't in the collision. I stayed with her." The paramedic looked at him for a second, working out the geometry of this. "Are you with her? Friend? Family? No. We were on the bus." "Okay." The paramedic nodded, wrote something on his clipboard, moved on. Sophie looked over at Daniel from her chair. "You can go," she said. Her voice was matter-of-fact. Not dismissive, but direct in the way someone is direct when they're used to managing a room. "I know," Daniel said. He didn't move. Something about that made her expression do something complicated, brief, and quickly recovered. The female paramedic looked up from her assessment. "The shoulder's not dislocated, but I'd recommend imaging to rule out a partial tear. You've got some real tenderness here, and given your—" She paused, recalibrated. "Given your baseline, we want to make sure we're not missing something." "Given my baseline," Sophie repeated in a tone that was flat in a specific way. "I meant regarding the impact to the chair, and I know what you meant," Sophie said it without heat. She'd had this particular conversation, or versions of it, enough times to have worn smooth the places where she used to catch. "I'll have it looked at. I have an orthopedic contact. I'd recommend not waiting. I won't wait." She said it with the quiet finality of someone who has learned that the only way to end well-meaning medical conversations is to agree with sufficient conviction. "Thank you." The paramedics exchanged a look, the small, professional kind, and wrapped up. They'd file a report. They'd recommend she follow up. They gave her a card with a reference number on it, and she took it with her right hand and put it in the pocket of her coat. The bus driver was talking to another transit official who'd arrived. Most of the original passengers had long since dispersed. The bus had been delayed long enough that several had walked or flagged other rides, and the remaining few had filtered off during the response process. The bus was emptier now, and quieter, which made the gray morning light through the windows more apparent. Daniel looked at his watch. 9:47. The interview had started 17 minutes ago. Callaway Group was 12 blocks away. He did the math out of something like habit, the way you keep pressing a bruise to check if it still hurts. It still hurt. "There's a coffee place on Meridian," Sophie said. He looked at her. "Half a block from here. If you want to not be standing on a bus that smells like someone's bad morning." He looked at her for a second. "Are you asking me for coffee?" "I'm suggesting a location change," she said. "You can interpret that however you want." The place was called Ghostas, which was either the owner's name or something else entirely. The sign gave no further information. It was the kind of narrow, worn-in coffee shop that had survived 4 decades and 3 neighborhood transformations through some combination of good product and sheer stubbornness. The booths were wooden and dark, the kind of wood that gets polished by use rather than maintenance. It smelled like espresso and something baking, sweet and faintly yeasty. It was accessible, which Sophie had clearly known. She rolled through without checking, had probably mapped this place before, or had been here before, or both. They took the booth in the back corner, which had space beside it for her chair. A server materialized almost immediately, a young woman with her hair in a bun and a pen tucked behind her ear who took their order without ceremony. Black coffee for Daniel, an Americano for Sophie, and a piece of whatever was in the case near the front for Sophie, who pointed at it and said, "That one," without looking at the menu. The server left. The quiet settled. "The shoulder," Daniel said. "How bad?" "Manageable." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "I've had worse." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. There it was again. That recalculation behind her eyes, the slight adjustment of some internal setting. It hurts, she said. But I've been hurt worse. The imaging will tell me if there's real damage. When are you going to go? Today. This afternoon. Not this morning? I have a board call at 11 and a meeting at 2. Daniel looked at her. Your shoulder might have a tear in it. My shoulder will still have a tear in it at 4 o'clock, she said evenly. The board call is the board call. He let that go. It wasn't his place to argue, and also, he recognized the logic. It was the same logic that had gotten him out of bed this morning with $42 in a savings account and a suit he couldn't afford to dry clean twice, to go interview for a job that was now gone, because not going hadn't been an option either. What do you do? He asked. I run a company. What kind of company? Supply chain infrastructure. She took a sip of her coffee. Software and logistics strategy primarily. We help companies figure out why their operations cost more than they should and what to do about it. Daniel sat with that for a moment. Callaway Group does similar work. Callaway does consulting. We build systems, slightly different animal. She looked at him. You know supply chain? 4 years of it. Project management, operational efficiency, some vendor relations work. Different scale than I imagine you're operating at, but the bones are the same. What company? Renfield and Associates. They restructured in November. Yeah, I was part of the restructuring. She nodded, not sympathetically, not in a performed way, just a nod that said she'd absorbed the information and was placing it. What was the role at Callaway? Operations manager. Which group? Mid-Atlantic Division. She turned her cup again. It was a habit, he noticed, something her hands did while her mind was elsewhere. Why didn't you leave? She asked. He looked up. What? On the bus. Why didn't you just leave? You had an interview. You had a reason. Nobody would have blamed you for going. He thought about how to answer this. Not because the answer was complicated, but because the simple version sounded too clean, and he'd learned that the simple version of things usually left out the parts that were actually true. I looked at you, he said, and everyone else was looking away, and I just couldn't. That's it? That's it. She seemed to be waiting for more. When it didn't come, she looked down at her coffee. Most people have a reason, she said. It came out quieter than the rest of what she'd said. A reason why they can't. Why this isn't a good moment. Why someone else will handle it. Most people probably would have. Most people definitely would have. There was no bitterness in it. Just the particular flatness of a fact she'd learned through accumulation of evidence rather than assumption. I'm in a wheelchair on a city bus during rush hour after an altercation. I am exactly the category of person that most people walk past. Daniel didn't say anything. There wasn't anything useful to say that would be better than just letting that sit. She ate a bite of the pastry, looked out the window at the gray street. How old's your daughter? She asked. He looked at her. You heard that? You were 2 feet from me on a bus, and people talk louder on phones than they think. He felt a faint heat in his face. He wasn't sure what she'd caught of that conversation, how much context she'd gotten, whether she'd understood what was at stake, or just that he had somewhere else to be. She's 7, he said. What's her name? Ellie. Something that wasn't quite a smile moved across Sophie's face, fast, like weather. What's she like? Daniel thought about her drawing, the house with the tree, the 2 figures out front, me and Dad. She's a lot, he said. She told me this morning that my gray tie makes me look like I'm already apologizing for something. Sophie laughed. It was short and surprised, like it got out before she could decide whether to let it. She's right. I know. I wore the blue one. Good call. She ate another bite, looked at him more directly. What are you going to do? About the job? I don't know yet. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. My recruiter's going to try to explain, but I already know they won't reschedule. They had a specific timeline. I was the choice they'd already made, and I didn't show up. Do you have other prospects? I have a few applications out, nothing as far along as this was. She was looking at him steadily now, with an attention that had a quality to it. Focused, weighing, the kind of attention that people who run companies develop because they're always, at some level, evaluating. "What did you prep for the Callaway interview?" she asked. He looked at her. "What?" "Your prep. What were the areas you focused on?" It was such an unexpected question that he answered before he thought about why she was asking. Operational efficiency. I put together a framework for how I'd approach their current division structure based on what's publicly available about their portfolio. I had 3 case examples from my Renfield work that I thought were relevant to what they're dealing with in the Mid-Atlantic market. What's their problem in Mid-Atlantic? They're running at higher cost per output than their Southeast division, which is doing the same work. From what I could find in their client reporting, it's a vendor fragmentation issue. Too many small contracts that should be consolidated. It's a common problem when companies grow fast without centralizing procurement. Sophie was quiet for a moment. That's a fairly specific read. It's what the numbers suggest. She turned her coffee cup again. Then she said, I know someone at Callaway. We've done adjacent work on a couple of engagements. I could make a call. Daniel looked at her. I'm not asking for that. I know you're not. I mean, I don't want the thing because you called someone. Sophie set her cup down. When she looked at him, there was something careful in it, not unkind but direct. Daniel, you gave up the shot at the thing to help someone who couldn't help themselves in that moment. I'm not offering to buy you a job. I'm offering to call someone who respects me and tell them what actually happened this morning so they can make an informed decision about whether their timeline is worth reconsidering. What they do with that is their business. He sat with that. It was a meaningful distinction. He wasn't entirely sure he believed it worked that way in practice, but he recognized that she wasn't offering charity and that there was a difference between the two things she was describing. Okay, he said. She took out her phone with her right hand, typed something one-handed with a focused ease. Her left arm stayed in her lap. Do you have a card? She asked. He hesitated. His cards were in the briefcase, old Renfield cards, with the company's name on them, which was not the impression he wanted to make. But he'd also written his personal contact information on the back of several as a workaround. He opened the briefcase and found one, crossed out the Renfield logo with the pen from his jacket pocket, wrote his cell number and email on the back. He handed it to her. She looked at it for a moment, something brief passing across her face. You crossed out their logo, she said. I know. I haven't gotten new ones made. It seemed presumptuous, I guess. Ordering cards before I had somewhere to go. She looked at the card for another second, then put it in her coat pocket. They finished their coffee. The conversation moved around, the way conversations do when the acute part of an emergency has passed and 2 people are still sitting in the same place with no particular reason to leave. She asked about his background, and he answered without dressing it up. The 4 years at Renfield, the project before that, the city he'd moved from, the degree in business operations from a state university that wasn't going to impress anyone but had been useful. He didn't mention Amanda or the particular shape of the last 6 years. Some things were available and some weren't. She didn't offer equivalent information, not in any organized way, but pieces came out. She'd started her company 5 years ago. After 2 years of recovery and planning she didn't describe in detail. She had 15 full-time employees and a handful of contractors. She was currently in a capital raise, which was why the board call at 11 was non-negotiable. She traveled too much. She ate at her desk more than was reasonable. The accident, Daniel said, and then stopped. She looked at him. I'm sorry. That's not... I shouldn't have started that sentence. You want to ask about it? Not if you don't want to talk about it. She looked at him for a moment. It was a particular kind of looking, measuring, not hostile. 3 years ago, she said. Car accident. Not my fault. Not particularly interesting as a story. The vehicle damage was totaled. The spinal damage was... She paused. Significant and permanent. She said it the way you say a fact you've said enough times that the words no longer carry the full weight of what they contain. I spent most of that year in a hospital and then a rehab facility in upstate New York. My father came every weekend. My company didn't exist yet. The accident, in a strange way, was why I started it. I had a long timeline still to think about what I actually wanted to do. I'm sorry, Daniel said. Don't be. I mean, yes, fine, be sorry. I know it's polite, but I don't need you to be sorry. I needed someone to stay on a bus this morning, and you did that. She picked up her coffee. That accounts for a lot? He didn't say anything. The morning light had changed outside, still gray but brighter. The particular shift that happens when clouds thin without fully clearing. The street outside Gosta's had the normal mid-morning quality of a city block that's past the rush. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. Marcus Webb. He answered. Yeah. Daniel. Marcus's voice had the specific quality of someone delivering news they've cushioned as much as possible but not quite enough. I talked to their hiring manager. And? They've already moved on. They had 3 candidates at the final stage. They offered the position to their second choice an hour ago. Daniel was quiet for a moment. $42, the rent notice, the drawing with the house and the tree, the big plant that went to the ceiling. Okay, he said. Daniel, it's okay, Marcus. I appreciate you calling. I've got 2 other roles I think could be good fits. Can we set up a call this week? Yeah, Thursday? Thursday works. Daniel, for what it's worth, what you did this morning. That's, Yeah. He wasn't sure he did know exactly, but he appreciated the attempt. Thursday. He hung up, looked at the phone for a second, then set it face down on the table. Sophie had heard, not all of it, but enough. She didn't say anything immediately, which he appreciated. She just sat with it for a moment. Then, I'm going to make that call. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. She said it patiently, like she was clarifying a misunderstanding rather than making a point. I want to. There's a difference. He looked at her. At the controlled, particular face of a woman who'd spent 3 years learning how to be harder than she'd needed to be before, and who still, he could see it, the way you see something structural in how a person sits in a room, still let things in at the edges, still let a stranger's small decency register. How's the shoulder? He asked. Worse than it was 20 minutes ago, she said flatly. I'm going to call a car. Good. I mean it about the call. I know. She looked at him once more, steady with that particular attention she gave things. Then she picked up her phone, one-handed, and started typing. Daniel picked up his coffee, which was mostly gone, and drank the last of it. The briefcase sat on the bench beside him. His suit was still pressed. The blue tie was still straight. Outside, a car went by with its radio on, something with a beat that faded before he could make it out. A woman walked past the window with a child on her hip, the child looking back over the woman's shoulder at the street, like it was the most interesting thing he'd ever seen. The server from before was refilling coffee 2 tables down and chatting with an older man in a hat who was holding his cup with both hands and laughing at something. The morning had not gone the way Daniel planned. It had gone, in fact, about as badly as a morning could go without involving anything permanent. He was down 1 job opportunity, approximately $9 in transit fares, and a coffee he'd paid for with the card he hadn't wanted to use. And whatever small reserve of hope a man in his position runs on when he gets up in the morning and puts on a good suit and tells his daughter when instead of if. He should have felt worse than he did. He wasn't sure exactly what that meant, only that he'd made a choice this morning in 4 seconds in a crowded bus aisle, and that the choice hadn't been wrong. Not in a way he could explain to a bank account or a landlord, but in the way that, when he thought about going home and seeing Ellie at 3:30, he wasn't going to have to figure out how to look at her while carrying something that didn't fit right. That was something. He didn't know yet if it was enough. He picked up his briefcase, straightened his tie by feel, and went to wait outside while Sophie called her car. The March air was cold and clean and smelled like rain that hadn't come yet. Sophie's car came in 7 minutes, a black sedan, clean, the kind of car that belonged to a service account rather than a personal driver. Impersonal, but reliable, which seemed to suit her. The driver got out and opened the rear door without being asked, which meant he'd done this before, and Sophie moved from the chair to the seat in a single practice transfer that Daniel watched without watching, the way you learn to observe things while making it clear you're not observing them. The chair folded and went in the trunk. Before the door closed, she looked at him through the window. I'll call today, she said. After the board meeting. You're going to the imaging first, he said. She looked at him with an expression that was not quite irritation and not quite amusement. Yes, Daniel. Today? Not after the 2 o'clock. I said yes. You said you'd go today. I'm specifying before 2. She held his gaze for a moment. Fine. Before 2. Thank you. She pulled the door shut. The car moved into traffic. He watched it go until it turned the corner, then stood on the sidewalk for a moment with his briefcase and his blue tie, and no particular place to be for the first time in 4 months that hadn't felt like failure. It still felt like failure. He wasn't going to pretend it didn't. But there was something else mixed in with it now, something he couldn't quite name, that made it sit differently than it had on other bad mornings. He started walking. He had 6 hours before he needed to pick up Ellie. He spent the first hour in a library 2 blocks from Gosta's, not because he'd planned to, but because it was warm and quiet and had tables, and when you have nowhere to go, libraries are the most dignified version of nowhere. He sat at a table near the window and opened his laptop and went through his email, which contained 2 automated rejection notices from applications he'd submitted 3 weeks ago and a newsletter he'd never signed up for. He unsubscribed from the newsletter. He filed the rejections in the folder where he kept them, which now had 29 entries in it. He sat looking at the screen for a while. Then he opened a new document and started writing out his analysis of Callaway Group's Mid-Atlantic operational structure, the vendor fragmentation problem, the procurement consolidation strategy he'd built his interview prep around. Not because he'd presented anywhere, just because the work was there in his head and it had nowhere else to go, and doing it felt better than not doing it. He spent an hour on it. When he was done, it was 11 pages, clean and specific, the kind of document that looked like it had cost someone real hours, because it had. He saved it and closed the laptop. On the walk to the transit stop to go pick up Ellie, early, which was unusual, his phone rang. Unknown number, local area code. He answered. Daniel Carter. Mr. Carter. The voice was male, older, unhurried in the way that people are unhurried when they're accustomed to other people waiting on them. My name is William Lang. I believe you met my daughter this morning. Daniel stopped walking. Around him, the street continued its mid-morning flow, indifferent. Yes, he said. She called me from the car on her way to a medical appointment. A pause that wasn't uncomfortable, more like a pause of someone choosing words with precision. She told me what happened on the bus. Daniel said nothing. He wasn't sure what response was being invited here. She didn't tell me everything immediately, William Lang continued. Sophie tends to give the headline and leave the details out when she thinks the details will cause me to react, so I had to ask her several times. Another pause. She told me you stayed, that you'd had an important job interview and you stayed anyway. Yes. She also told me you tried to refuse when she offered to make a call on your behalf. I wasn't comfortable with the... I know why, William said. She explained that too. The tone was matter-of-fact, not congratulatory, more like a man accounting for a set of facts and finding the inventory accurate. I'd like to meet you, Mr. Carter, if you're available. Daniel looked down the street. A pigeon was investigating something near a trash can. A woman went by with a stroller, phone in one hand. Ordinary Tuesday, everywhere except inside his own head. When? He asked. This afternoon, if possible. My office is downtown on the 14th floor of the Seton building. Would 4 o'clock work? 4 o'clock. He'd pick up Ellie at 3:30. He'd need to call someone, Mrs. Okafor maybe, who'd offered before when he was in a pinch. I can make 4 o'clock work, he said. Good. Ask for me at the front desk. They'll bring you up. He hung up and stood still for a moment. Then he called Mrs. Okafor, who picked up on the second ring and said yes before he'd even finished the sentence, and told him to bring Ellie over whenever. She'd made too much soup anyway. He was at Ellie's school at 3:28. She came out of the building at 3:31, backpack on, lunch bag swinging, and spotted him from the top of the steps with the immediate recognition that children have for the specific adult they're looking for in a crowd. She came down the steps fast. You're early, she said. I know. She looked at him. That same evaluating look from the morning, trained on his face, reading it in whatever way 7-year-olds read faces. How did it go? He crouched down. I missed the interview. Her face shifted. The complicated, specific face of a child who's learned to manage disappointment alongside the person they love most, who doesn't want to make it worse by showing too much. "Oh," she said. "There was an accident on the bus. Someone was hurt, and I stayed to help them." She was quiet for a moment, working through this. "Are they okay?" "I think so, probably. She hurt her shoulder." "She went to the doctor?" "She was on her way when I last saw her." Ellie nodded. The processing was visible. She had her mother's quality of thought, the way Amanda had moved through things sequentially, one piece at a time. "So the job," she said. "They gave it to someone else. They had a deadline." She looked at her shoes for a second, then back up at him. "That's not fair." "No," he agreed. "It's not. But you did the right thing." "I think so." "You know so," she said, with the flat certainty of someone who'd already reached the conclusion before the sentence was finished. "Dad, if you'd walked past and got the job and she'd gotten worse, you'd think about that forever." He looked at his daughter, the red jacket with the broken zipper pull that he still hadn't fixed, the lunch bag with the drawing of a dog on it, the face that was so much more than 7. "I have a meeting this afternoon," he said, "with a man who it's related to this morning. I don't know what it is yet, but I need you to go to Mrs. Okafor's for a few hours." "Does she have the soup?" "She said she made too much." Ellie picked up her lunch bag. "Okay," she said, with the pragmatic grace of a child who's learned to hold uncertainty without drowning in it. "You'll tell me everything later?" "Everything I know." "Promise?" "Yeah, I promise." She reached over and straightened his tie, which had gone slightly left since the morning. She did it with 2 fingers, a small, precise adjustment. Then she picked up her bag and they started walking. The Seton building was 14 stories of mid-century glass and steel in the center of Harwick's financial district, the kind of building that had been impressive in 1974 and had maintained a certain authority by virtue of being permanent. The lobby had marble floors and a security desk, and the man behind it was professional in the way of someone who'd seen every variety of visitor and had opinions about none of them. Daniel gave his name. The man made a call, nodded, produced a visitor's badge, and directed him to the elevator bank on the left. The 14th floor was not ostentatious, which surprised him slightly. He'd formed some expectation based on the name and the building and the unhurried telephone manner, and what he'd expected was polished, expensive, the particular version of corporate that performs its wealth outward. What he found was a suite of offices that were nice but not showy. Good furniture, clean lines, actual books on shelves that looked read rather than decorative. The receptionist, a woman in her 40s with reading glasses pushed up on her head, smiled at him and told him Mr. Lang would be right out. William Lang appeared 2 minutes later. He was in his late 60s, maybe 70. Tall. Daniel was 6 feet, and this man met him at eye level with some to spare. Silver-haired in a way that looked biological rather than cultivated. He was wearing a suit that fit very well and a tie that had been loosened about an inch, which was the one visible concession to the afternoon. He walked with a slight forward lean that wasn't quite a stoop, more like someone in the habit of moving toward things. He extended his hand. "Mr. Carter." Daniel shook it. "Mr. Lang." "William, come in." The office was a corner room with windows looking south and east, the city spread out in gray-green afternoon light. There was a desk that had actual work on it, papers, a laptop, a coffee cup that was half empty and had been there a while, 2 chairs facing the desk, the kind that were comfortable without trying to impress you. William gestured at one and took the seat behind the desk. "Sophie called me from the car," he said, picking up where the phone conversation had ended, as though the 3 hours in between hadn't happened. "She told me the short version. When I asked for the longer version, she got annoyed." He said this with a dry familiarity that was clearly long established. "She does that when she thinks I'm going to make something bigger than she wants it to be." "She seems to prefer things on her own terms," Daniel said. "She does. She's been that way since she was about 12 years old." He folded his hands on the desk. "I did some homework this morning after she called. I know who you worked for, what you did there. I know about the restructuring. I know that company a little, used to know the CFO socially. They made a mess of their 4th quarter and took it out on their people." He said it plainly, without drama. "I know what you were going for at Callaway." Daniel said nothing. "I know what it cost you to miss it," William said. I made the choice myself, Daniel said. I'm not looking for— I know you're not. William held up a hand, not impatiently, but with a precision that suggested he'd anticipated this particular objection. Sophie told me about the conversation at the coffee shop. She said you were uncomfortable with the idea of the call to Callaway. She said you used the word charity. I said I didn't want the thing because someone called someone. She said the same. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the windows, a cloud shifted and the afternoon light changed, going warmer for a moment before flattening back out. I want to tell you something, Mr. Carter. I've been in business for 40 years. I've hired a lot of people. I've made good hires and I've made bad ones. And over 40 years, you develop a sense for the difference. Not because you get magical at reading people, but because you start to understand what the indicators actually are. Not the resume, not the interview performance. Those things are important, but they're also, to a significant degree, rehearsed. He paused. What I'm interested in is what a person does when nobody is watching, when there's no upside, when every rational calculation says go the other direction. He let that sit. My daughter has been in a wheelchair for 3 years, William said, and his voice changed when he said it. Not breaking, nothing like that, but the way a voice changes when it's been through something and carries the weight of it permanently. In 3 years, I have watched people look past her, talk over her, ignore her in rooms she was running. On public transit, I have seen what people do when she needs help. Mostly what they do is decide it's not their problem. He looked at Daniel steadily. You stayed on a bus and missed a job interview to make sure my daughter was not alone and hurt and uncared for. You called it because it was the right call and because you could not make yourself walk away from a person in distress. That is not a small thing. I do not believe it is a common thing. Daniel looked at the desk, the half-empty coffee cup, the papers with handwriting on them in 2 different pens. I didn't do it for this, he said. I know you didn't. That's precisely why I'm doing this. William reached to the side of his desk and picked up a single sheet of paper, placed it on the desk facing Daniel. This is a position within Lang Capital. We're a holdings and advisory company. We manage a portfolio of operating businesses and provide strategic oversight to about 12 partner companies. This role is Director of Operations, focused on the Mid-Atlantic region. It's a senior position, the salary is competitive, there's a formal benefits package and an equity component that vests over 3 years. Daniel looked at the paper without picking it up. I want to be clear about something, William continued. This position exists. It has existed for 5 months. I've interviewed 11 candidates for it, and I haven't been satisfied. I'm not creating it for you. I'm offering it to you because in the last 3 hours of background work, everything I found suggests you would be excellent at it. And because what happened this morning confirmed something about your character that a resume and an interview can't confirm. Daniel picked up the paper. He read it slowly. The title, the responsibilities, the compensation line, which he read twice. It was more than Callaway, more than Renfield, more than he'd been making before Renfield. He set the paper down. I want to ask you something, he said. Go ahead. Why director? Why not something that would have a normal progression, something I'd grow into? William looked at him for a moment. Because the role is director-level work, and I don't see the point in pretending it isn't so I can pay you less. That's a straightforward answer. I tend to give those. A slight adjustment in his expression. Not quite a smile, but its immediate neighbor. Do you have questions about the role itself? About 15, Daniel said. But I'd like to think first, if that's acceptable. I'd be concerned if you didn't want to think. William leaned back slightly. Take a day or two. If you have questions after reading, call me directly. He slid a card across the desk. Simple, white, black print, phone and email. Daniel took the card. He looked at it. William Lang, followed by a title that was just his name. The card of someone who didn't need to list what they did because people already knew. Sophie, Daniel said, does she know about this meeting? She does. Did she ask you to do this? She told me what happened and said she thought I should know. Whether I acted on it was my decision. He paused. She did tell me one other thing. Daniel waited. She said, William's voice had a different quality now, careful and plain, that when everyone else on the bus was looking away, you looked directly at her and asked if she was hurt, not if she was fine. Not whether you could call someone for her. You asked if she was hurt. He was quiet for a moment. She said it was the first time in a long time that someone spoke to her on public transit like she was a person who might have a real answer to that question. Daniel didn't say anything. He looked at the paper on the desk and outside the window at the city going gray in the late afternoon, and thought about a bus in the morning and a woman with a controlled face and a shoulder she was holding wrong, and how 4 seconds of decision, less than that really, more like reflex, had landed him in this room. He thought about Ellie, about the drawing on the desk, the house with the tree, the 2 figures out front, about the big plant that went to the ceiling. "I'll think about it," he said. William nodded once. "Good. Can I ask, how is she, Sophie? Her shoulder?" "She went for imaging this afternoon, as you apparently insisted." Something in his face, brief, warm, quickly composed. "Partial rotator cuff strain, no tear. She'll need physical therapy, which she's already arguing about." "That sounds right," Daniel said. He stood and shook William Lang's hand again at the door. The grip was the same as before, firm, no performance to it. In the elevator, going down, Daniel looked at the piece of paper in his hand and the card and the old scuffed briefcase that had belonged to his father, and he stood very still through the whole 14-floor descent, not thinking about any one thing in particular, just holding all of it at once, the morning and the bus and the coffee and the library and the 11-page document he'd written for nobody and the woman with the controlled face and her father's voice on the phone and the position that had been open for 5 months and the 3 years of watching and the question he'd asked and the way she'd answered it. The elevator doors opened onto the marble lobby. The security guard nodded at him. He walked out into the afternoon. The cold hit him the same as it had that morning, clean and with an edge to it. He turned up his collar and started walking in the direction of Mrs. Okafor's building, where his daughter was eating soup and waiting for him to come tell her everything he knew. He had no idea, walking those blocks, what he was going to decide. The offer was real, and it was more than he'd expected, and it had conditions attached to it that weren't financial. Conditions of history and context, and a debt that wasn't financial either, and that he'd have to figure out how to carry if he said yes. But the rent was 31 days overdue. Ellie's tuition was due by end of week. There were $42 in the savings account and $12 in checking, and a broken zipper pull on a red jacket that a 7-year-old had never once complained about. And somewhere in a city apartment, there was a ceiling with a water stain shaped like Texas, and a drawing of a house with a tree, and a blank space on the wall where something could grow if given enough light and enough room. He walked 3 blocks before he realized he'd straightened his tie again without meaning to. Some habits, he thought, you don't even notice until they're already done. Mrs. Okafor lived in 4C with a cat named Bernard, and more photographs on her walls than Daniel had ever counted. Framed pictures of people and places spanning what looked like 6 decades, arranged without any organizing principle except that they mattered to her. The apartment always smelled like whatever she'd cooked most recently, which was usually something that made the hallway outside her door smell better than anywhere else on the 4th floor. When Daniel knocked, Ellie opened the door. She'd clearly been waiting near it. "You're back," she said. "I said I would be." She looked at his face the way she'd looked at it that morning, and then she stepped back to let him in. Mrs. Okafor was in the kitchen, and Bernard was on the back of the couch, in the particular arrangement of organized indifference that cats achieve when they want you to know they noticed you, but aren't committing to an opinion. Daniel, Mrs. Dis. Okafor appeared in his kitchen doorway, a dish towel over one shoulder. She was a small woman with white hair cut close and the kind of face that had earned every line on it. "You want soup? There's still plenty." "I'm okay, thank you." That means yes. She disappeared back into the kitchen. Ellie was sitting on the couch now, legs tucked under her, watching him. He sat in the chair across from her and put the briefcase on the floor and loosened his tie by about the same inch that William Lang had loosened his. He felt suddenly very tired. Not the hollow tired of a bad morning, but the deeper tired that comes after a long day of things that mattered. "Tell me," Ellie said. He told her. Not everything. There were pieces he simplified and pieces he left out, the financial specifics, the full weight of the rent and tuition situation, which he'd been carrying carefully out of her line of sight for weeks. But the shape of it he gave her straight. The bus, Sophie, the injury, the missed interview, the coffee at Ghosta's, the call from William Lang, the office on the 14th floor. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, her hands in her lap, looking at the middle distance the way she did when she was working through something. "He just offered you the job?" she said finally. "He offered me the interview, or not exactly. He told me the position was real and that he'd done background on me and thought I was qualified, and that what happened on the bus mattered to him. He wants me to think about it and call him. But he wants you to take it." "I think so." "Do you want to take it?" He looked at his daughter. This was the thing about Ellie. She cut straight to the operative question without decorating it first. He'd never been sure whether that was something she'd learned or something she'd been born with, but it was consistent, and it was, most of the time, exactly the question he needed to answer. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "I want to understand it better first." "What don't you understand?" "Why I deserve it." Ellie looked at him with an expression he recognized. A particular patience that she shouldn't have been old enough to have, that she'd developed in the specific crucible of being a child who paid close attention to the adults around her. "Dad," she said, "you have a degree. You did the job really well for 4 years. You got fired because of money stuff that had nothing to do with you. You prepared for 3 other interviews. You've been trying every day for 4 months." She said all of this with the quiet accumulation of someone who has been listening when the adults thought she wasn't. "You didn't get this because you were lucky on a bus. You got it because someone finally saw who you actually are." Daniel looked at the floor. Bernard chose this moment to walk across the back of the couch and step directly onto Ellie's head, which she tolerated with the long-suffering expression of someone who had accepted this as a recurring feature of visits to 4C. "Bernard," she said flatly. Bernard sat on her head for a moment, decided against it, and moved to her shoulder. "The other thing," Daniel said. Ellie looked at him from under the cat. "What other thing?" "The woman, Sophie. Her father is offering me this job, at least in part because of what I did for her. I keep coming back to that. Whether it changes what the thing is. Whether I can take it without feeling like I'm being compensated. For something that shouldn't require compensation." Ellie removed Bernard from her shoulder with both hands, deposited him on the cushion beside her, and looked at Daniel with full attention. "Did the job exist before today?" she asked. "He said 5 months. "Did he invent it because of you?" "He said he had 11 candidates and none of them were right. So the job was real and you're qualified and he thinks you can do it." She looked at him. "I don't understand the problem." "The problem is how I got in the room." "You got in the room because you did something good," she said. "That's different from knowing someone or being related to someone or whatever. You didn't ask him. He called you." She picked up Bernard again, adjusted him in her lap. "If the job was luck, that would be one thing. But it wasn't luck, it was you. You did the right thing, and it happened to matter to the right person. I don't think that's bad luck. I think that's just how some things work sometimes." Mrs. Okafor came out of the kitchen with a bowl of soup and set it on the side table next to Daniel without comment, then went back to the kitchen. He looked at the soup. It was something with chicken and root vegetables, dark and fragrant. He picked up the spoon. "You're very wise for someone who had a cat on their head 30 seconds ago," he said. "I contain multitudes," Ellie said. He stared at her. "Where did you get that?" "School. Miss Petrakis said it. I wrote it down." He ate a spoonful of soup. It was very good. He called William Lang the next morning at 8:45. William answered on the second ring. "Mr. Carter." "I have questions," Daniel said. "I assumed you would. Go ahead." He'd written them out the night before, after Ellie was in bed. Not to be formal about it, just because writing things out was how he thought. He sat at the kitchen table with the list and a coffee and the morning quiet. "The 11 candidates," he said. "What was the sticking point?" "A beat. Technical competence without judgment, or judgment without the operational depth. The role requires both in equal measure. You can't outsource one to the other." "What's the biggest current problem in the Mid-Atlantic portfolio?" 3 of our partner companies have vendor overlap that's generating cost redundancy. We've known about it for 2 years and haven't moved on it because none of the previous operations staff had the bandwidth or the authority structure to address it cross-company.
Do you have data on the overlap? I have 3 years of it. Can I see it before I answer? A pause, slightly longer this time. Yes, William said. I can have it sent to you today, redacted for the partner company's names until we have a formal agreement in place, but the operational data will be intact.
That's fine. Daniel looked at his list. One more. Go on. Sophie. She runs her own company. She's successful. She's going to be around in some capacity in this context. I want to know if there's a version of this where that becomes complicated. The silence on the other end had a different quality this time. Not reluctant, more considered. That's an honest question, William said. It seemed worth asking directly. Sophie is her own person. Her company operates independently of Lang Capital, and she has no role in this decision or this position. Whether you two have a professional relationship going forward is between you. He paused. I will tell you that my daughter is not naive and she's not sentimental, and if she thought this offer was inappropriate or was going to put you in an uncomfortable position, she would have said so, loudly. I believe that, Daniel said. She also asked me this morning whether I'd called you yet. Something in his voice, brief and contained. She pretended she was asking for other reasons. Daniel didn't say anything to that. He looked at his list. There was one more item on it, but it wasn't a question for William. Send me the data, he said. I'll have an answer by end of day tomorrow. That's acceptable. William paused. Mr. Carter, I want to be clear about one thing, separate from the professional considerations. Okay? What you did on that bus was not a small thing to me personally. Sophie doesn't ask for help. She doesn't accept it easily. She has reasons for that, which I won't speak to on her behalf. His voice was steady and even, but there was weight behind it that was clearly old and belonged to the 3 years of imaging results in rehab facilities and a father who drove hours every weekend. When she calls me to tell me someone treated her with basic human decency, it means something went badly wrong. And when she calls me to tell me someone genuinely looked out for her, that happens rarely enough that I take note of it. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Thank you, he said. Call me tomorrow. The data came at noon. It was a 60-page document with the partner company names replaced by designations, Company A, Company B, Company C, and 3 years of vendor contracts, procurement records, and cost reporting. Daniel read it straight through at the kitchen table with a second coffee and a pad of paper, making notes. He didn't eat lunch. By mid-afternoon, he had mapped the vendor overlap and identified 3 consolidation opportunities that could, conservatively, reduce combined operational costs by somewhere between 12 and 18% over 24 months. He'd done similar work at Renfield. The scale was different. This was more complex, multi-entity, with the added dimension of managing toward companies that Lang Capital didn't fully own. But the architecture of the problem was familiar. He knew this kind of work. He was good at it. He sat back in his chair and looked at what he'd put on the paper. It was real. The problem was real. His ability to address it was real. Whatever the circumstances of how he'd come to be sitting at this kitchen table with this document, the work itself existed independently of all of it. He thought about what Ellie had said. You didn't get this because you were lucky on a bus. It was you. He picked up the phone. Not to call William. He'd found Sophie Lang's company online the previous afternoon. Lang Infrastructure Solutions. A clean, simple website with a clear description of their work and a contact page that listed a general email. He'd found her on a professional networking site, a minimal profile with her company title, and a headshot that looked like it had been taken under protest. He'd found a brief interview she'd done with a business publication 6 months ago, 2 pages on operational strategy and the future of supply chain infrastructure, which had been characteristically precise and had given away nothing personal. He didn't have her number. She hadn't given it to him. The card she had was his. Old Renfield card, Renfield logo crossed out, cell number written in pen. He wasn't going to call her company line. He put the phone down. 4 minutes later, his phone rang. Unknown number.
Carter, he answered, out of old habit.
You reviewed the data.
Sophie's voice.
Matter of fact, as though they'd been mid-conversation. He looked at the pad of paper in front of him. How did you... My father called me after you talked this morning. He said you asked for the data before answering. A pause. That was the right call, by the way. 11 out of 11 candidates just said yes, without seeing the data. Without seeing the data, she said it the way you say a thing that explains several other things. How's your shoulder? He asked. Terrible. The physical therapist wants me 3 times a week, and I've already argued her down to twice. You shouldn't have argued at all. It's my shoulder. It's your rotator cuff. Same shoulder. He looked at the ceiling. The water stain that looked like Texas was above the bedroom, not the kitchen, but he looked anyway. I have a question for you, he said. Okay. Did you know, when we were at Gosta's, when I told you about Callaway, did you know who your father was going to call me? A silence. Not evasive, genuinely considering. I knew he'd want to know, she said. I know my father. He's been running companies for 40 years and he still believes in the kind of thing that happened on that bus. That character shows itself in small moments. Another pause. I didn't tell him to call you, but I knew when I told him that he probably would. Is that the same thing? I'm not sure, Daniel said honestly. Does it change how you feel about the offer? He thought about this. He'd been thinking about it in different forms since yesterday afternoon in William Lang's office. I keep trying to separate the pieces, he said. What I know I can do, what the job actually needs, how I got in the door, whether the door is the point. The door is never the point, Sophie said. Every person who ever got hired got there through some combination of what they knew and who knew them. That's not corruption, that's just how information moves. Her voice was flat in the way it got when she was saying something she'd thought through carefully. The question is whether you can do the work. From what my father said, you asked for 60 pages of operational data before you'd give an answer. Honestly, that's more rigor than most people bring. I found 3 consolidation opportunities, he said. Rough estimates, 24-month horizon, 12 to 18% cost reduction depending on how the vendor negotiations go. A silence. You did that today, she said. I had time. You had the data for 4 hours. I know this kind of problem. He looked at the pad. The numbers were there, laid out in the careful shorthand he'd developed over 4 years of doing this work. I'm not saying I'm right. I'd need the full data, the named companies, the actual contract terms. But the shape of it, I know what I'm looking at. Sophie was quiet for a moment, then, tell my father that when you call him tomorrow. I will. And take the job, Daniel. He let that sit for a second, just like that. Not just like that, she said. You spent 4 months being methodical and prepared and getting doors closed in your face. You stayed on a bus when every rational thing said leave. You asked for data before you answered. You called me separately to, check? Make sure it was real? Something like that. It's real, she said. The work is real. My father doesn't make pity offers. And you. She stopped. Started again differently. When you asked me on the bus if I was hurt, you said it like the answer mattered. Not like you were managing a situation. Like the answer actually mattered. Another pause. People underestimate how rare that is. He didn't say anything. Outside the kitchen window, the late afternoon light was going amber, the particular color March makes when it's deciding to become something else. How's the physical therapy going? He asked again, after a moment. I told you, terrible. Are you going? Yes, I'm going. Both times a week? Yes, Daniel. Good. He could hear in the silence that followed that she was about to hang up, and he could also hear something else in it, some smaller thing that neither of them had the vocabulary yet for, which was fine. There was time for vocabulary. Or there wasn't. Either way, it wasn't the point of today. Call him tomorrow, she said. I will. The line went quiet. He sat at the kitchen table for a while after that, looking at the pad of paper. The numbers on it were real. The work they represented was real. His ability to do that work had nothing to do with buses or accidents or the particular shape of a bad Tuesday morning. It had been built over years, quietly, in offices and conference calls and late reports, and the accumulated hours of doing something well enough that it became second nature. The morning had created a door. What he carried through it was his. He picked up the pad and read through his notes one more time. Then he went to fix the zipper pull on Ellie's red jacket, which he'd been meaning to do for 2 weeks, and which took him 11 minutes and a pair of needle-nose pliers and a moment of real satisfaction when the thing finally caught and held. He tested it 3 times. It held all 3 times. He hung the jacket back on the hook by the door and went to start dinner. He called William Lang at 8:53 the next morning, 7 minutes before the hour, because he'd been ready since 8:30, and waiting the full time felt artificial. William answered on the first ring. "Mr. Carter." "I've reviewed the data," Daniel said. "I found 3 vendor consolidation opportunities in the overlap between your partner companies. Conservative estimate, 12 to 18% cost reduction over 24 months, depending on how the negotiations run. That's without seeing the actual contract terms or knowing the companies by name, which means the real number could be better. I'd want 30 days with the full data before I committed to a projection." A pause. Not surprised. More like a man who'd been watching a particular kind of evidence accumulate and had just received the last piece. "You'll have the full data on your first day," William said. "I'm going to accept the position," Daniel said, "on the condition that it's understood I'm taking it because I can do the work, and that's the basis on which I expect to be evaluated, not the circumstances." "Those are the only terms I'm offering it on," William said. "The circumstances told me to look at you. Your record told me you could do the job. Those are different things, and I've always known the difference." "Okay," Daniel said. "Okay," William said. There was something in his voice, not warmth exactly, more the particular satisfaction of a man who has been doing something for 40 years and still occasionally finds it worthwhile. "HR will contact you today with the formal offer. We'd like you to start the second week of April, if that's workable." "That's workable? Good." A brief pause. "Welcome to Lang Capital, Mr. Carter. Say." He hung up and sat at the kitchen table with his phone face down and his coffee going cold, and the morning light coming through the window at the angle it came through in late March, when the days were getting longer, but the light was still thin. Ellie had already left for school. He'd made her breakfast and walked her out and come back up and sat here for the last 20 minutes getting ready to make a 2-minute phone call. He looked around the kitchen, at the 43 rejection emails filed in a folder on his laptop, at the rent notice he'd finally taken off the refrigerator 2 days ago after paying it with the last draw on a small emergency credit line he'd been saving for something worse, at the post-it note Marcus Webb had inspired him to put up 4 months ago. This one's real. He'd left it there through everything, a small, stubborn flag. He got up and took it down. Not because it wasn't true anymore, because its job was done. The formal offer arrived at 11:15. Daniel read it 3 times, slowly, in the manner of a person who has learned not to assume good things are exactly as good as they appear until he's verified each line. It was as William had described: the salary, the benefits, the equity structure, the 3-year vest. The title was Director of Operations, Mid-Atlantic Region, reporting directly to the CEO, who was William Lang. He called Marcus Webb. "Marcus?" "Daniel, hey, what's going on? I've been trying to reach you about those 2 roles I mentioned. I accepted a position this morning." A pause. "You... what?" "Lang Capital, Director of Operations." The silence on the other end had a particular quality. The silence of someone recalibrating everything they thought they knew about how the last 48 hours had gone. "Daniel," Marcus's voice had shifted. "Lang Capital is... that's a serious company." "I know. How did you..." He stopped, started again. "How did this happen?" "Long story involving a bus," Daniel said. "I'll tell you sometime." "A bus?" "Yeah." Another pause. "Are you serious right now?" "I am." "Director level, at Lang?" "Yes." Marcus made a sound that wasn't quite a word, then, "Man, I put you forward for 43 applications in 4 months, and you get director at Lang Capital from a bus." "You put me forward for 43 applications," Daniel said. "That's not nothing.
That's how I got good at interviewing. That's how I knew how to walk into that office on the 14th floor and ask for the data before I answered. He meant it. I'll send you a referral if I hear of anything good. Yeah, Marcus said, sounding slightly dazed. Yeah, please do that.
He started the second week of April, on a Monday, which was cool and clear, the city finally deciding on spring after weeks of arguing about it. He wore the suit and the blue tie, which Ellie had again specified, and he carried his father's briefcase because it was still the right one for the occasion, scuffed corners and all. The Lang Capital offices were on the 14th floor of the Seton building, the same floor as William's office, but occupying a larger footprint than he'd seen on his first visit. A full suite of workspaces, 8 people on the operations team, 2 assistants, a conference room with a whiteboard that had 4 different people's handwriting on it from what looked like a recent and spirited disagreement. William met him at the door, which Daniel suspected was not his usual practice, but which carried the specific weight of a gesture made intentionally. He gave him a brief tour, introduced him to the team, and then left him to it, which was, Daniel would come to understand, William's management style in its entirety. He hired people he trusted, gave them what they needed, and let them work. Daniel spent the first morning reading the full data, the named partner companies, the actual contracts, the real numbers behind the redacted document he'd worked through in his kitchen. He sat at his new desk, which was clean and bare in the way of a space that had been empty for 5 months, and he read with the same focused attention he'd given everything since the beginning. And by noon, he had confirmed his preliminary analysis and identified a 4th consolidation opportunity he'd missed in the redacted version because the detail had been in a footnote that didn't survive the redaction. He wrote it up and sent it to William by end of day. William replied at 6:15 with 4 words. This is why. Good. The first month was difficult in the way that new things are difficult. Not because the work was beyond him, but because the work was real and complex, and the gap between knowing how to do something and actually having done it in a specific environment takes time to close. He made a mistake in his 3rd week, a judgment call on a vendor negotiation timeline that turned out to be too aggressive, and the partner company pushed back and the negotiation stalled for 10 days. He told William directly, explained what he'd misjudged, laid out how he was going to correct it. William listened, asked 2 questions, and said, "Fix it. Let me know when it's done." He fixed it. It took 3 weeks instead of 10 days, and the final terms were slightly less favorable than his original target, but the deal closed. He wrote a post-mortem on his own error that was 2 pages long and put it in the project file, not because anyone asked for it, but because that was how he worked. Documentation of failure alongside documentation of success, because both contained information. He also paid the rent on time for the first time in 5 months. He paid Ellie's school tuition in full. He walked into the building's management office and paid 2 months ahead, which he'd never been able to do before, and felt something release in his chest that he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He didn't tell Ellie about the financials in detail. She was 7, and those weren't her numbers to carry. But one Saturday morning in late April, he took her to a garden center 3 blocks from their apartment, a cramped, pleasant place that smelled like soil and green things. And he told her to pick the one she wanted. She spent 19 minutes on the decision, which he expected. She chose a fiddle leaf fig, 3 feet tall with wide dark leaves, and a thin trunk that the nursery worker said would need staking for a year or 2 until it got strong enough to support itself. Daniel looked at the tree and thought about his daughter and didn't say anything about the metaphor because she was 7 and she'd find it annoying, and also because some things are more useful when they're just lived rather than pointed at. They carried it home between them, 1 hand each on the pot. It went in the corner of the living room near the window, where the afternoon light came in best. It needed, the nursery worker had told them, consistent indirect light, occasional watering, and patience. It would sulk sometimes, drop a leaf when the conditions changed, and then recover. They all do, she'd said. You just have to keep showing up. Ellie named it Leonard. He saw Sophie for the first time after Gosta's in the last week of April. It was not a planned meeting, or not exactly. William had mentioned, without particular emphasis, that Sophie sometimes came to the Lang Capital offices when she needed a conference room for a client call and her own office was unavailable. Daniel had nodded and filed it and not thought about it again until he turned a corner in the hallway with a folder under his arm and almost walked directly into her. She was in a different chair than the one from the bus. This one was lighter, more maneuverable, clearly a deliberate upgrade. The laptop bag was the same. The coat was different, navy instead of gray. They both stopped. "Carter," she said. "Lang," he said. A beat of slightly awkward recalibration. The specific awkwardness of two people who had been through a significant thing together and are now encountering each other in a different context with no established script for the transition. "Your shoulder," he said. "Better. The physical therapist says I'm ahead of schedule." She paused. "I told her I was motivated." "Are you?" "I hate being told I can't do things." She said it plainly. "It's a good motivator." "How's the board raise?" "Closed. We hit the target." "Congratulations." It took 4 weeks longer than projected, and I had 3 conversations with investors that I would describe as genuinely unpleasant. But yes, we got there. She tilted her head slightly. "My father says you sent him a 4-point analysis on your first day." "It was on the data he gave me. The 4th point wasn't in the redacted version." Something shifted in her expression. Appreciation, contained. "He also says you filed a post-mortem on yourself after the Harman vendor negotiation." Daniel looked at her. "He told you about that?" "He mentioned it in the context of telling me he thought he'd made a good hire." "I made a mistake." You documented it voluntarily and corrected it. That's not a small thing in an operations role. Most people bury the mistake and move on." She looked at him steadily. He hired 11 candidates who didn't do that. He held her gaze for a moment. The hallway was empty, afternoon quiet, the particular hush of a workplace in the tail end of the day. "Coffee," he said. She looked at him. "What?" "There's a coffee machine in the break room at the end of the hall. It's not as good as Gusta's, but it's functional. Do you want coffee?" A pause. Then, "Yes, I have 20 minutes before my call." They went down the hall and he poured 2 coffees from the machine, black for him, Americano approximation for her, and they sat at the small table in the corner of the break room and talked for 22 minutes, which ran 2 minutes over her call, which she acknowledged with a look at her phone and a small contained expression that suggested she'd let it run over deliberately. That was how it started, the second time. It did not go smoothly. That should be said plainly. They were 2 people who had developed independently the habit of managing their own situations without expecting help from anyone. Sophie had 3 years of learning that most people were unreliable in the specific ways that mattered, and Daniel had 4 months, which sat on top of 6 years, of learning that the gap between what people offer and what they deliver was wider than he'd been raised to expect. Neither of them was particularly good at being vulnerable in front of another person, and both of them defaulted to competence as a defense. They argued in May about something small that was actually about something larger. Sophie had called him. They were calling each other by then, not constantly but regularly, in the unhurried cadence of 2 people who find each other worth talking to. And she'd said something dismissive about a choice he'd made in a negotiation, not mean, but the way she sometimes was when she was tired, too direct, without the cushion of awareness that sometimes people need the cushion. He'd pushed back and she'd pushed back harder, and they'd ended the call without resolving it, and he'd sat at his kitchen table afterwards feeling the specific frustration of a person who has found something good and is watching himself potentially ruin it. He called her back 20 minutes later. "I was too defensive," he said. A silence. "I was dismissive." "You were also right about the negotiation. I did rush the close." "You got a good outcome anyway." "I got a passable outcome. I could have gotten a better one." Another silence. Then quietly, "I'm not good at the softer edges of this conversation. I know that about myself." She said it the way she said most honest things. Flat, without drama, like a fact she'd accepted. "I spent 3 years in medical settings where everyone was either clinical or falsely cheerful. And I built a company where precision is the primary value. And I think I've flattened some things that maybe shouldn't be flat." "I spent 4 months in a sustained low-grade panic," Daniel said. "I'm not exactly arriving at this fully put together either." "No," she said. But you're... She stopped, started again. You're the kind of person who calls back. He sat with that. Outside his window, the May evening was warm and the city was making all its usual sounds. From down the hall, he could hear Ellie's cartoon, the particular music of it. We can try to be better at the soft edges, he said. I can try, she said. I can't promise to be good at it. I'm not asking for good, he said. Just try. Okay, she said, and meant it. They were not perfect after that. They had other arguments, other moments of clumsy navigation, other times where the gap between what each of them needed and what they were able to ask for created friction. But they also had the 22-minute coffee that became a standing Wednesday thing, and they had phone calls that started as professional and became personal and ended somewhere in between. And they had the particular quality of two people who are, slowly and imperfectly, and with genuine effort, choosing each other. The foundation came from Sophie. She brought it up in July, over coffee at Gusta's. See, they'd gone back. It had become the unofficial place for conversations that needed the real version of themselves rather than the hallway version. She'd been thinking about it, she said, for a while. There are people in this city who end up in situations like yours was, she said. 4 months out of work, trying to hold everything together, no margin for error. And the thing that keeps most of them from getting through it isn't capability. It's the gap, the period between losing something and finding the next thing, when the basic infrastructure collapses because there's no buffer. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. That habit, the rotation, which he now recognized as how she thought. What if there was something that addressed that gap specifically? Not charity, not handouts, practical support. Emergency rent stabilization, childcare coverage during job searches, skills training, access to professional networks, the stuff that gives people enough runway to get to the next thing on their own terms. Daniel looked at her. He thought about the $42 in the savings account, the rent notice soft at the fold from being read too many times, Ellie carrying her lunch bag with the dog drawing on it without ever once complaining about the state of things. You want to start a foundation, he said. I want to start something that works, she said, which means it has to be operationally sound, not just well-intentioned. That means someone who can build the infrastructure. She looked at him. You'd be on the board, if you wanted. As operations. As whatever you want to call it. You'd build how it runs. He thought about it for about 30 seconds, which was not as long as it might seem because he'd been thinking about variations of this question. What do you do with the thing that happened to you? Where do you put it? Since April. Yes, he said. That was fast. I've had time to think about it. They spent the next hour at Gusta's working out the rough shape of it on paper napkins, which was not how foundations were usually built, but was how this one started. The server who'd been there on the morning of the bus recognized them by now. She brought a third coffee without being asked and said, looking at the napkins, "Whatever you're building, it looks serious." "It is," Sophie said. "Good," the server said, and went back to her tables. The Carter Lang Foundation was formally registered in October, 8 months after a Tuesday morning on the number 12 bus. It was named after some argument with both their names. Sophie had initially resisted, said it was Daniel's story, the origin was his, the name should reflect that. Daniel had said the origin was a bus full of strangers and a choice made in 4 seconds, and a woman who'd told the right person what had happened and that both of their names were accurate. She'd agreed, eventually, with the look of someone who had been out-argued on a point of logic and was choosing to be gracious about it. The foundation launched with a modest operating budget. Sophie had provided seed funding from her capital raise surplus, and William Lang had contributed without being asked, which had caused Sophie to look at her father for a long moment and say, "I didn't ask you for that," and William to say, "I know," and leave it at that. In the first year, it helped 31 families in Harwick navigate employment gaps. Emergency rental assistance, childcare stabilization, job search support, professional network connections. Not all of them found what they were looking for immediately. Some needed the help twice. One man, a former logistics coordinator who'd been out of work for 7 months, found a position through a network connection. The foundation facilitated and came back 3 months later to volunteer as a reference for other candidates. He became their first volunteer coordinator. The numbers were not dramatic. 31 families was not a lot. Daniel knew that, tracked it, thought about it. But each of those 31 families had contained a person in the particular suspended state he knew intimately. The state of trying to hold the machinery of a life together on insufficient resources while also trying to build towards something better, which was an almost impossible combination of tasks and which, with a small and targeted intervention, became survivable. Survivable was enough. Survivable was the bridge to the next thing. Okay. On a Saturday in November, 9 months after the bus, Daniel took Ellie to the park near their apartment. A different apartment now, still in Harwick, 2 bedrooms, one more than they'd had, with a living room that got afternoon light and a view of the street that was not romantic but was alive, which was what he wanted. Leonard the fiddle-leaf fig had been moved with great ceremony and was in the new corner and had, in the course of the moving and adjustment, dropped 4 leaves and then produced 6 new ones, which the nursery worker had predicted, and which Daniel had explained to Ellie as the plant deciding whether it trusted the new situation. She'd thought about that seriously. "Do you think it trusts it now?" "I think it's getting there," he'd said. "That's good enough," she'd decided. At the park, Ellie was on the swings and Daniel was on the bench, doing the specific thing that parents do on benches at parks. The divided attention of watching and thinking at the same time, the 2 streams running parallel. He was thinking about the Foundation's first annual report, which he'd been drafting. He was thinking about a vendor contract at Lang Capital that needed revision. He was thinking about Sophie, who was in Seattle for a client engagement and had texted that morning at 6:45 from a hotel room. "West Coast mornings are wrong. Everything starts too early here. You'd hate it." He'd texted back, "You hate it. I'm fine." She'd replied with a single word, "False." He was smiling at his phone when Ellie appeared in front of him, having abandoned the swings. She stood there for a moment, wind-messed and slightly flushed, looking at him with that look. "You're doing the phone smile," she said. "I have a phone smile?" "You have a specific smile for one specific person," she said, in the tone of someone reporting an observable phenomenon. "It's different from your other phone smiles." He put his phone away. "Your sneakers untied." She looked down, then sat on the bench beside him and tied it without comment. Then, "Do you like her?" He thought about not answering, or deflecting, or being vague in the way that adults are vague with children about the things that matter. Then he thought about Ellie, at 7 years old, who had told him his gray tie made him look like he was already apologizing, and who had said, "You know," so when he'd said he thought he'd done the right thing, and who had carried $12 and $42 and rent notices and tuition deadlines in the careful way of a child who pretends not to know what she knows because she doesn't want to make it worse. "Yeah," he said. "I do." Ellie nodded, processed. "Is she nice?" "She's direct. She's very direct. She doesn't sugarcoat things." "Do you want things sugar-coated?" "Not really." "Then that's good." He looked at his daughter on the park bench, in the red jacket with the zipper that now worked, in the November afternoon that was cold enough for her breath to show when she breathed. "You okay with it?" he asked. She gave him the look one more time, the full attention evaluation that he had stopped finding surprising and started finding one of the things he was most grateful for, this particular quality of being seen clearly by someone who loved him without conditions. "Dad," she said, "you went 4 months without a real break. You missed a job interview to help someone you didn't know. You ate soup at Mrs. Okafor's and called it dinner twice. You fixed my zipper at like 11 at night." She looked at him steadily. "You deserve something good. You've deserved it the whole time, but the fact that it came from a bus doesn't make it less yours." He didn't say anything for a moment. "She has a plant too," he offered. "In her office, a big one." Ellie looked at him. "How big?" "Pretty close to the ceiling." His daughter nodded with the air of someone for whom this settled something. Then she stood up and went back to the swings and left him on the bench with the November wind and his phone and the complicated, imperfect, entirely real shape of a life that had been rebuilt not from luck or rescue, but from 4 seconds of not walking away and everything that had been put in motion by those 4 seconds, still moving. There is a version of this story where the lesson is simple. Do the right thing, and the right things happen. But that is not really the lesson, or it is only the surface of it, and the surface is the part that misleads. The real version is more complicated. Daniel Carter did the right thing on a bus, and it cost him something genuine. The most promising job opportunity he'd had in 4 months, in a situation where those opportunities were scarce and the cost of missing them was real, and landed on a child who was too young to carry it. The sacrifice was not painless. The right thing often isn't. The people who tell you otherwise have either never been tested or have edited the memory into something easier to hold. What the morning on the bus revealed was not magic or fate. It was character. A thing that had been built over years of ordinary, unglamorous effort. The kind that doesn't get witnessed. The kind that happens in the gap between what you want to do and what you actually do when the moment costs you something. Character is not what you are when it's easy. It's what you are at 9:15 on a Tuesday when your interview starts in 45 minutes and a stranger needs someone to stay. William Lang had been right about something. The small moments tell the real story, not the resume, not the performance, not the practiced answer to the behavioral question, the moment when nobody is watching and the incentive structure says go the other way and you stop anyway. That is the data that matters. Most people never get the circumstance that makes that data visible. Daniel had been unlucky in a lot of ways for a lot of months, and then he'd been standing in the right aisle on the right morning when a person needed the thing he was capable of giving, and what happened after was not separate from who he was. It was a direct consequence of it. That is not a small distinction. It is maybe the only distinction that matters. Ellie was pumping the swing higher now, her legs kicking out in the arc of it, her head back in the particular freedom of a child gaining altitude. The park was mostly empty in the November chill. 2 dogs were doing the sideways investigation thing at the edge of the path. A man was walking with headphones on, barely noticing anything. The city moved the way cities move, indifferent, continuous, generating its endless ordinary texture of things happening simultaneously, most of them invisible to each other, most of them never intersecting in any meaningful way. Some of them do. His phone buzzed. Sophie. Flight delayed 2 hours. I'm writing the foundation grant proposal in an airport Chili's. This is your fault for making me care about operational timelines. He typed back, You love operational timelines. 3 seconds. I tolerate them. Different thing. Then after a pause, How's the park? He looked at Ellie on the swing, her breath making small clouds in the cold. Good, he typed. She wants to know how big your plant is. 30 seconds. Then, why does she want to know that? She has a system. A longer pause. Then, it's almost to the ceiling. It dropped some leaves when I moved it, but it's coming back. He looked at that for a moment, then typed, Tell it to be patient. They always come back. He put his phone in his pocket, stood up from the bench, walked to the edge of the swing set, and stood there while Ellie swung in long arcs above him. And she grinned when she saw him and pumped higher, and he stood in the November cold with his hands in his pockets, thinking that the thing about a life is that it doesn't look like anything from the inside until suddenly, briefly, you catch a glimpse of the shape of it from slightly outside. And what he saw was this: a man and his daughter in a park in the afternoon, the foundation report in his bag, the new apartment with its afternoon light, Leonard growing toward the ceiling in the living room corner, a woman in an airport in Seattle writing grant proposals and getting the timeline right, the 31 families and the one who'd come back to volunteer, the briefcase that had belonged to his father, the water stain shaped like Texas that he'd stared at in the dark and that was no longer his ceiling to stare at, the blue tie that was right all along, the zipper that held. None of it had been smooth. None of it had been given. All of it had been built, piece by ordinary piece, from the material of who he actually was, which was not exceptional or heroic, was just a man who had learned somewhere along the way, in the patient accumulation of small choices, that you cannot walk past the person who needs you and remain entirely yourself. He hadn't walked past. Everything else had followed from that. Ellie came down from the swing in a controlled jump, stuck the landing approximately, stumbled sideways and announced 9.4. Out of 10? Out of 12. I'm working on a new system. He put his arm around her shoulders. She was almost too big for this, but not quite, still in that brief remaining window of being small enough. She leaned in without making it a thing, the way she did. Ready to go home? He asked. Is there food? I was going to figure that out. Figure it out on the way. she said, and they walked out of the park together into the ordinary afternoon, ordinary city, ordinary November, which was everything and was enough.